Hey everyone, so today I want to go over the engine and underhood features of the S550 GT350. I want to start off by going around the engine compartment and then getting into the engine itself and going over everything up close and in detail and explaining what all the componentry is under the hood of this car. Now starting from the passenger side of the car, underneath this plastic cover you have the battery. It's held in by a few plastic clips, so it's very easy to get this cover off should you need to access the battery, and you can see the positive and negative leads that run to it. Directly in front of that is the strut tower. You can see all the various reinforcement they add to this because this is a structural component that needs to be nice and stiff. If you have a car with the adjustable strut mounts, you would adjust them by loosening these 3 bolts to dial in a more aggressive alignment setting. Next to that, this piece here is actually a structural component of the car. This is a part of the chassis. With most cars, this is covered up by the fenders, but the way the S550s are designed, this is exposed, but this is a structural member of the car. Here is the main underhood fuse box for the car. So if you have an electrical problem, this is one of the main places you want to start. You have various fuses and relays under here. And on the very back here, I have a lead for a battery tender mounted to it. And on the strut tower, I have the ground mounted here. Now, the reason you want to run it like that is because on these modern cars, they have a battery management system on them. And if you hook the leads directly to the battery management system can't tell that the car is being charged, especially in long-term storage like over the winter time. So it's a good idea to run it the way I have it set up so the battery management system is kept in the loop if you are charging the car. Directly below this fuse box, you have a control module down here. It's a little bit tight under this hood, so they had to get creative in the different places to store stuff, but you can see all the various wires and connectors running into that control module. Between the strut tower and the engine, you have the lines for the air conditioning system. Those unpainted silver lines are the hard lines for the AC system. And on the very back, just in front of the firewall, you can see where those lines go through the firewall into the passenger compartment. Just next to those are the lines for the heater core, those white lines with the silver caps on them. So that is where the climate controls go through the firewall into the passenger compartment to keep the car either heated or cooled. Moving forward, you can see more of the lines for the air conditioning system, the sensors. You can see the ports for connecting to it if you needed to do a recharge, as well as all the various wires that run to the front of the car. And you can see the very side of the radiator towards the front. Here's the refill for your windshield washer fluid. Now on the front of the car, you have a carbon fiber composite core support. So this is basically going to help tie the front of the car. And this is a structural component that helps to tie in things like the headlights and the bumpers themselves. Now, towards the end of GT350 production, Ford utilized the same core support for both the 350s and the 500s. So you're going to see on either car you have pieces that are not used, since this is a piece designed for multiple cars. Example being, on my car I have the cutout here for the hood pin that comes standard on the 500, but since the 350s do not have hood pins, this is just left blank and left open. On the 350s, this retains the hood prop down, but if you see this on a GT500, you may wonder what this purpose this serves, and on the 500 it really serves no purpose, but since it's a multi-vehicle use part, there's just components that are not used on it. Now this does have a lot of pieces mounted to it. In the very front, you have the bumper that sets the height of the hood. So you can adjust this bumper up or down to make sure that the hood sits flush with the fender. Just in front of that, here you have a crash sensor. So if you get into an accident, this will tell the various safety systems inside the car that an accident is detected, and it can deploy the various safety systems. And as I said, part of the headlight is mounted to this carbon fiber core support, since this is a structural component. And the front bumper cover, they utilize these little pins to line everything up, and then one bolt basically just to hold everything down. Here you have the overflow bottle for the coolant system. You can see the overflow lines that run in and out of the radiator. Obviously this has a cap on it. This is clear so you can easily see the level of coolant in that overflow bottle. Also you have the hood latch in the front. This does have a sensor on it, so if the hood's open, it will tell you in the gauge cluster that the hood's open. This piece here is basically just a cap that helps hold down the radiator itself. This piece and this piece are actually bolted together with this bolt. So this is actually not the top of the radiator, but this is just basically a structural cover that holds it down, and the radiator just sort of tucks in underneath of that. Here you have the shroud for the main engine fan, just in front of and below the air intake. And then moving over to the other side of the core support, basically everything's symmetrical on the other side. You have the cutout for the hood pin that would have been on a 500, the crash sensor, the bumper that sets the height of the hood. And in the case of the 350s, you have this bolt here that holds the hood prop in. Moving along, you obviously have an open style air filter on this car. Unlike the 500s that is closed, this one is open and exposed, and it is fed in through an opening on the front here. So you basically get a nice ram air effect when you're going down the road. Here is the cable housing for the hood. So this runs into the passenger compartment, obviously. You can pull that, that's near your left leg. And that'll run to the latch to open up the hood. Now, when they assemble the chassis on the Mustangs, these are basically assembled by machine, and a lot of times when they're welding them in the factory, it's not uncommon for a lot of sparks to be flying around, and it's not uncommon to you'll get a bunch of little, they show up on camera, a couple little like dots here. This is basically slag from welding, so when the sparks are flying in the factory and these chassis are being welded by machines, sometimes they land on here. Again, like I said, this piece is normally covered up by the fender in most cars, but on the S550 Mustangs, it's exposed. So if you do get some little bit of welding slag pieces here, that is normal. That is not an indication that some welding has been done or some repairs have been done on the car. My GT500 is the exact same way. So you may notice that if you are looking at a S550 Mustang. The strut tower is basically symmetrical side to side, so it's basically going to look exactly the same left to right. One thing to note is that if you do have the adjustable strut mounts, they are side specific. The non-adjustable ones are not, but the adjustable ones are and will have a label on them, labeling them driver or passenger side. Just behind that, here you have the distribution block that also doubles as the ABS pump. You'll see the two main lines come out of the master cylinder on the other side. They run into here. Are then distributed to each one of the four brake calipers themselves, and the cylindrical piece is the ABS pump. So if you ever go down the road and you ever have to slam on the brakes and you feel that pulsation underneath your foot, that comes from here. The firewall itself, you have the brake booster that is vacuum actuated. You have the reservoir for the brake fluid. Now, because the S550 GT350s have a hydraulic clutch, they share fluid from the braking system for the hydraulic clutch. So that is what this line here is for. Some owners have noted that over time, this will start to back off a little bit. It's never come off to the point where they would start to leak, but it's a good idea to check these once in a while, just to make sure that this does not back off and to push this on the rest of the way if it starts to back off. And then you have the master cylinder, like I just said, mounted below that. Just above the engine, you have this enormous strut tower brace, and then it is also supported on the side here, and then there's another piece of it that's sort of hidden under the plastic there. This is also to structurally tie the front of the car. It ties the towers into themselves, so under extreme cornering loads, the chassis is much less likely to flex. These were very popular aftermarket add-ons years ago, but more and more manufacturers are starting to put them on because it does help make the chassis much more structurally strong and rigid. Now let's get into the engine itself. Obviously, on the top of the engine, you have the intake manifold. You can see all the nice long runners for the intake manifold. On the back side of the engine, you have quite a bit going on back here. On the very top there, those are valves to shut air on or off to those pneumatic actuators back there. Those are basically vacuum-controlled pneumatic actuators for the vacuum-controlled systems in the car, those black cylindrical pieces, and those blue connectors are the valves that will turn them on or off to control the airflow to them. And then the various lines run up front to them. These white valves here are one-way air valves, so that's part of that system to control the air to make sure it only goes one direction. As you start to move around the engine compartment, you see these two large black lines here. There's one on each side. These are the lines that go into the heater core. You can see on this side where it actually goes into the back there that I spoke about before. And then you have these basically cosmetic pieces that they act as a shelf for those lines. You see they are labeled 5.2 flat plane crank engine. And on the passenger side, you have the plaque that is signed by the engine builders. The later engines were built by one engine builder. The early cars had two builders. So early cars, you will see two signatures on them. You have one of the fuel lines on the driver's side, and then towards the front of the engine. This is the vapor canister purge valve for the emissions system itself. Then on the very front of the engine, obviously, you have the throttle body. This is an 87 millimeter electrically actuated throttle body. You can see the housing here for the electric motor, and then the various connectors for it. The tube here for the intake, this has a mass airflow sensor on it. The GT500 have a MAP sensor. This has a mass airflow on it. So these are a little bit different the way the engines are metered from the 350 to the 500. Moving side to side on the engine, you have the coil covers on top here that say powered by Ford. Underneath those are the coil packs, and below those are the spark plugs. One individual coil pack per cylinder. And you just have a plastic cover that holds them down. You also have a plastic cam cover. Unlike the 500s that are metal, since this engine does not generate nearly as much heat as the 500, they utilize plastic on this. Obviously, you have the engine fill here, the oil fill for the engine there. You also have sensors for the cam phasers, one for each of the 4 cam phasers, 2 on each side. Now, really the only modification under the hood of this car is an air oil separator. Normally, this would not be here from the factory. You would have the PCV valve would connect directly to the backside of the intake manifold behind the throttle body. But adding this basically controls all the oil that would be pushed into the intake manifold from blow-by, and it basically catches it in this. This is from Ford Performance, so this has a nice OE look. It basically looks like it was here from the factory. And I like running these things because it helps the intake from getting gummed up over time, from all that oily mist that's created from blow-by from the engine itself. Moving towards the driver's side of the engine, you can see more of the main coolant hoses that come off of the engine. Here you have a breather that is in front of the throttle body. Now on Ford vehicles, typically you will often see people running passenger side mounted air oil separators as opposed to driver side. Some vehicles have driver side ones available, some do not. This is because the driver side typically does not get a lot of that blow-by in it because this is in front of the throttle body. So it's really not under a lot of vacuum. The passenger side is behind the throttle body. So it's always under a lot more vacuum. So you tend to get a lot more stuff pulled up on the passenger side. That's why you usually see passenger side mounted air oil separators on Ford vehicles. It's pretty symmetrical side to side for the most part. Here you can see the fuel rail for the engine. Below that you can see all of the injectors tucked in alongside the intake manifold. And then you have more of the coil packs underneath this coil cover. And then you also have the dipstick on the side. That's also the reason I don't like running the driver's side air oil separator. It makes it a little bit more difficult to check the oil, which you definitely want to do on the 350s because they tend to burn a little bit more oil. Below that, you have the exhaust manifold. Ford started to use more of a header style on these cars to help promote a little bit better airflow on the cars. Down there, just below the exhaust manifold, you have the mount for the engine. You have the aluminum mount and mounted directly to that. That blue part is the actual mount itself that's made out of a rubbery plastic material to basically act as a vibration dampener for it. So you don't notice vibrations from the engine nearly as much. And then just in front of that, you have the alternator tucked in there right in front of the exhaust manifold, and you can see some of the various heat shielding that they put on there to help keep the engine's heat away from the electrical components of the alternator. And then moving towards the front of the engine itself, on the engine, you have 2 separate belts on this engine. You can see at the very bottom, you have the crank pulley. You can see one belt goes off to the left. That only runs the AC compressor. So if you had a car that did not have air conditioning, that belt just wouldn't be there and you'd have no AC compressor on the side. And then you have the main larger belt runs everything else. The water pump, The alternator has all, and then you have all the various tensioners and idler pulleys that run off of that. Then at the very bottom, you have the hookups for the oil cooler that run off of the adapter on the front of the engine. You also have the front sway bar all the way down at the very bottom. So that pretty much covers all of the detailed componentry under the hood of the S550 GT350. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching.